When people who have seizures, there's an electrical storm in their brain, and this can be picked up using EEG. And so what we've done is map those EEGs onto pitches in music. And so just by listening to this music, you can tell whether someone is having a seizure.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 216th episode of this podcast, looking at anything and everything that you can do to help harmonize the workings of your own brain, including making tactical use of that most human of inventions, music. Now, I know technically there are a lot of animals that make things that we might consider music, but humans definitely take music to a level that is not approached by anything else in the animal kingdom. We have our brains to thank for that, and our brains are also the direct beneficiaries of benefits conveyed by music. Music performance has been shown to change brain structures. Even music appreciation can change the state that a brain's in, and we'll be talking with a researcher who studies the many links between music and the brain, Dr. Psyche Loui, in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, I'm going to tell you, and I will also provide you a link, about one of the coolest audio illusions that you are likely to come across. I know audio illusions is not a term that might be intuitively obvious what I'm talking about, but rest assured, such things do exist. But for right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
The processing of human speech is one of those areas where the devil really is in the details, doing things like picking out the correct human voice among a crowd of people speaking, or being able to pick out inflections that a person's making as they're speaking. We get practice at this from a young age. Most of us are so good at it that we don't even think about it, but that doesn't mean that the complexity isn't there under the surface. And that complexity is something that researchers need to contend with as they find solutions for people that have hearing problems or neurological problems that affect their hearing. This past year, researchers at the University of California at San Francisco have made headway in learning which neuron systems within the brain are helping to dissect out the tonal information in human speech, said Claire Tang, the study's lead author. What we're seeing here is that there are neurons in the brain's neocortex that are processing not just what words are being said, but how those words are being said. To take a simple example of the way that tonality can change the meaning of a sentence, think about Bob stubbed his toe. You could say that with the emphasis on Bob. Bob stubbed his toe, which is like Bob as opposed to somebody else. Bob stubbed his toe. He didn't do something else with his toe, he stubbed it. Or Bob stubbed his toe. It was definitely his toe he stubbed, not something else. Or if you go up on the end, Bob stubbed his toe? Then we're asking, was it his toe he stubbed? These inflective changes in vocal pitch made when a person's speaking are called prosody, and prosody carries a lot of the actual information that we get across. All of which seems pretty obvious, except when you consider that these changes in pitch are going to be radically different depending on the speaker that's talking. What might still be a high tone if it's coming from an adult male would be a really low tone if it's coming from the register of a little girl. And this tonal information needs to be parsed alongside the basic phonetic information of, are we hearing a vowel or a consonant sound? And all of this is being dissected on a millisecond timescale. The researchers at UCSF had incentive to figure this out because some of the work they do at the UCSF Epilepsy Center involves removing brain tissue that's been found to incite epileptic seizures. But in order to make these very targeted tissue removals, they want to make sure that they're not going to interfere with the patient's ability to speak or to interpret speech. And they discovered that the brain's ability to parse inflections comes from a region called the superior temporal gyrus, and that different networks of neurons there have overlapping but distinct abilities. Some could distinguish between human voices based on the average vocal range of the speaker. Others couldn't identify the speaker but could tell what was being said, which you could kind of think of as being akin to reading the words flat on a page. And there was another group of neurons that could distinguish between the different intonation patterns. This last set of neurons changed their activity depending on where the emphasis fell in a sentence, but they didn't care what the sentence actually was or who was saying it. For the researchers to prove to themselves that they were actually understanding what the brain was doing correctly and that they'd found the correct network of neurons, they took various recorded sentences with different intonations, they algorithmically analyzed them, and then they predicted how these networks of neurons would respond. Then they played the actual audio, watched the brain's real responses, and got a pretty close match, says Tang. To me, this was one of the most exciting aspects of our study. We were able to show not just where prosody is encoded in the brain, but also how, by explaining the activity in terms of specific changes in vocal pitch. So now that they have a working model on how the brain is interpreting prosody, the next step is to figure out how the brain creates it. Says Edward Chang, the study's senior author. A major unanswered question is how the brain controls our vocal tracts to make these intonational speech sounds. We hope that we can solve this mystery soon.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart We have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Morales from the USA says, I just listened to the episode on sleep and light and I got a lot out of it. Planning to take a 30-minute walk every morning now. I'm guessing that's an episode that touted the cognitive benefits of getting outdoors. And listener AChamp1121, also from the USA, said, this is one of the best podcasts I listen to. I've been listening to it for a couple of years now and finally decided to leave a review because he keeps bugging his listeners about that. LOL. Well, thank you, A-Champ. Thank you, Morales. And thanks to everybody that's been leaving reviews. I will confirm A-Champ's accusation, not accusation, but assertion, that yes, if you will leave a iTunes review for Smart Drug Smarts, that would be very much appreciated. Strictly optional, but highly awesome. If you'd like to leave a review but aren't sure how, we've even got a little how-to page up on smartdrugsmarts.com/iTunes that gives a quick and dirty how-to. It's like a 45-second video, so very easy. In this past week's Brain Breakfast, we had a little preview of an upcoming episode I'm excited about. The Brain Breakfast, of course, being the email newsletter sibling to Smart Drug Smarts. If you are not yet signed up for the Brain Breakfast, we release that about once a week or so. Catch you up on neuroscience oddities, things that haven't quite made it onto the podcast yet, but might. Sometimes there is more news in the world of neuroscience than we can easily fit into the podcast, and the Brain Breakfast gives us a bit of an overflow valve. You can get signed up for that at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. And we are now in the final days of January, meaning there are still a few days left to get in on the January sale going on over at Vitamonk.com. Going for the length of the month of January, any new subscriptions that are signed up for entitles the subscriber to anything else that they might want to try off the Vitamonk shelf every 3 months following the initiation of that subscription. So in this case, we'd be talking April, July, October, etc. No special code there. You just got to pay a visit to the site. That is Vitamonk.com. And I mentioned last week that we were doing a final sell-down sale on the remaining stock of Nexus over at axonlabs.io. A lot of people have asked, by final, do you really mean final? And the kind of boring answer, but apparently still somewhat surprising, is yes, by final, we do mean final. I talked a couple episodes ago about the reasons behind that, so I won't rehash those details now. But as for what's going on at the Axon Labs website right now, you will see, if not currently, then certainly by the time this episode publishes, the biggest sale that we have ever done is currently underway. Price is not yet shockingly low, but definitely past surprising, on their way towards ludicrous. If they get that low, if the stock remains that long. We have been doing a day-by-day price drop for the last week, so if you want to see where we're at now, if any Nexus remains, you will find it up for sale at axonlabs.io.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Dr. Psyche Loui. She is a psychology and neuroscience researcher as well as a musician, as you will hear, and she holds an assistant professorship at Wesleyan University. Her first name actually is Psyche, just like it sounds, which is an amazing name for somebody that is a psychology researcher. You've probably heard about those statistical anomalies where if somebody's named George, they're more likely to move to the state of Georgia. Somebody with the name Dennis is more likely to become a dentist. Those sorts of weird little psychological pushes, but yeah, psyche and psychology. But Dr. Loui, as you will hear in this interview, has found a way to bridge her loves of music and neuroscience and studies things like how humans perceive and produce music, what's going on in the brain as that happens, how we develop expectations about what's coming next in music, and even how the different kinds of music we listen to can influence our brains in real time. Way back over 100 episodes ago, in episode number 107, I spoke with the guys who formed a company called Brain.fm talking about brainwave entrainment. And Dr. Louie's actually been working with them as part of the research end of their operation. So you'll hear a little about that coming up again in this interview. So prick up your ears, pull out your tuning forks, and get ready to jam with Dr. Psyche Loui.
I started playing piano when I was 5 and violin when I was 7. This is probably a good Asian girl kind of thing. My parents very much wanted me to be pre-med, also a good Asian girl thing. And so I thought I was going to study science and go to med school. But along the way, I'd always loved music. I've always loved playing in an orchestra with my friends. And then around college, I started taking more neuroscience courses. One particular course was cognitive neuroscience. And from that course, I started realizing that you can study these seemingly elusive subjective experiences, like our experience of music. We could try to understand that with neuroscience methods, such as EEG and fMRI. And I think that really prompted me to change my mind about what I was doing. So instead of applying to med school, I ended up applying to grad school to study psychology and neuroscience of music. This was also inspired by I think it was my junior year or my sophomore year, when I took cognitive neuroscience. There was a class project that involved this review of the literature on some branch of cognitive neuroscience studies. So I started looking into the literature about brain studies of music, and there weren't that many at the time, but one that really struck me was by Stefan Kolsch. It was published in 2000, and the title was "Non-Musicians Are Musical: Brain Indices of Music Processing." And what they did was present these chord progressions, Western tonal chord progressions that were either expected, sort of like your 1-4-5-1 standard chord progression, and then slightly unexpected and very unexpected. So there's this chord called the Neapolitan chord that it just sounds a little bit out of place among the rest of the chords. And so what the researchers did was they presented people with these different kinds of chord progressions that were either expected or unexpected while recording EEG, right? So brain potentials. And they saw this very clear signal that was in the brain potentials that was indicating expectancy. So when you were listening to the unexpected chord, it's a bit like when you're listening to a sentence that has a word that's out of place, right? We know that when we hear something like, I take my coffee with cream and socks, like you're not expecting the word socks, right? And so right after that word socks comes up, your brain kind of does a double take. And what Kolsch and his colleagues showed was that you have a similar kind of double take in your brain when you hear an unexpected chord. So, and this is even true for people who have no formal musical experience.
Is that culturally influenced? Does that vary with the type of music that a person is used to listening to as part of a culture, or even like the style of music they like? Or is that just common to music, common to the mathematics underlying music?
It's both, right? So this gets into where this knowledge comes from, right? Are you born with it? Is it something about physics? Is it something about your brain? Or is it something about the long-term experience that you have with sounds in the world? So to be fair, like the first study was done using Western music on Western participants. There haven't been as many studies on other populations as there should be. But what I ended up studying was exactly that question. Can we actually come up with a new musical system that uses mathematical properties that are plausible, that has the same physical rules as Western music, but is different from existing musical systems of the world? So that was the topic of my dissertation. And we showed that given this new musical system that no one ever heard of, but that was worked out mathematically, your brain can rapidly start to form the same kinds of expectations and the same kinds of brain signals that you've been using to process Western music all along. So it really suggests that our brains are very rapid learners. And given just 20 minutes, you can start to show the same brain potentials that we observe for Western music.
I assume that there must be some overlap between language processing and music processing. Like when we're teaching babies to speak, there's so much musicality to that teaching process for really young kids. It seems like we would be reusing or at least taking good advantage of some of those same brain systems.
Yes, we are definitely reusing the same resources. There's a researcher named Ani Patel who has this theory that posits some overlap between music resources and language resources in the brain. And I think that's received a lot of support, right? So the same areas that you use for language, you also use for music. And what exactly those regions are doing, well, probably some combination of early analysis of sounds, finding out the frequency structures within sounds, knowing what pitch sounds are, and then also later on, more syntactic or structural kinds of processing. Things like stringing different sounds together to form a phrase. That's needed for both music and for language.
The way that there's certain ages where it's definitely advantageous to learn a language, if you learn it young enough, you don't have an accent, things like that. Do we see there being close analogies there with the acquisition of language and the acquisition of music? Is there a sort of lockstep to those learning windows?
Yeah, well, there's definitely a sensitive period for learning music, much like there's a sensitive period for learning language. I would say they're generally later. So if you don't start musical training by the age of 10, you're very unlikely to make it to Carnegie Hall. But if you don't start talking by the age of 10, right, I think you have a lot more problems than just not making it to the Carnegie Hall, right? So we know that our brain selectivity for speech sounds start out earlier than our brain selectivity for musical sounds. But that said, by the age of 10, both sets of sounds should be very readily and efficiently processed in the brain.
What do you see are the biggest open questions right now that we might be on the cusp of learning about, like things that we might know in 5 years that we don't know yet?
Well, to me, there's a lot of open questions. Right now, one thing that really excites me, and I think there's more and more interest in it, is how do we become creative? We know that music engages a lot of the useful parts of the brain that can co-opt it for other things. And, there's lots of work on whether music training makes you smarter. And that goes back to the 1990s when the Mozart effect paper first came out and has largely been debunked.
That was the listen to Mozart while you're asleep and pick up a couple IQ points?
Yeah, right. Or like making your babies listen to Mozart and hoping that they'll do better on the SATs later. But that's largely been debunked. But the long-term effects of musical training on executive function and whether that transfers to non-musical functions such as math ability or language ability and spatial ability, those kinds of questions are very actively being investigated. And that's great. To me, I'm more interested in sort of more mysterious effects of music, maybe. And that has to do with creativity. Some of the best examples of human creativity, think like Mozart and Beethoven. These are musicians that came up with something that didn't exist before and then really changed the way people think after them. So how do you get like that? Modern day classical musical training, you actually don't get much training in generating new music on the spot, right? So you don't get to improvise as a classical musician going through conservatory training. But for jazz musicians, their whole job is to come up with new things on the spot. So looking at jazz improvisation can be a useful model for understanding where creativity comes from and how we can make use of it. So we have a project on jazz improvisation going on right now. We're working with the Center for the Arts at Wesleyan to compare people with different sorts of musical training, either no formal musical training or classical training or jazz training. And then we'll trace these subjects over the course of one semester. And so far, what we're seeing is that there are lots of functional and structural differences in the jazz musicians' brains compared to classical musicians and compared to non-musicians. So when a jazz improvising musician hears something that's slightly unexpected, their brain gets more engaged earlier on. They're more sensitive to the unexpectedness, and then they get more engaged. And then they actually accept that unexpectedness earlier than a classical musician. So for an uptight classical musician like myself, if I'm listening to a chord progression and something unexpected comes up, my first thought is, well, that was wrong. Right? Whereas a jazz musician, they're like, well, that's interesting. What can I do with it? So I think that difference in brain process, that's what we were able to pick up on in our EEG studies. And there's some structural correlates of that.
How fast do these responses take place?
They take place within 1 second. So when I'm just describing this initial perceptual sensitivity in jazz musicians, that's on the order of 200 milliseconds after the onset of the unexpected sound. And then the marker for engagement is around 500 milliseconds. And then the marker for acceptance is around 800 milliseconds. So within 1 second of anything unexpected happening, the classical musician and the jazz musician's brains have already done all these different things.
On the one hand, that's really fascinating. On the other hand, when you think about what is Mozart doing, what is Beethoven doing, it's not really the initial response as to what the brain does in the first seconds. It's kind of like what you actually do with that. Did you just go back and want to erase the mistake or take it off and create something new, sort of following this unexpected tweak to the overall design? And that seems like it must happen on a much longer time frame. How are you going to kind of scale that research to look at the actual creative process that follows minutes and hours rather than microseconds?
Yeah, I think there's many layers for learning how to become a creative musician. Some of it is at the level of milliseconds. So when you're improvising with a jazz band, they're looking at you, they're playing certain notes, you have to work with those notes, and that's a millisecond by millisecond process. But as you're going through training in life, you're working with a different coach who gives you certain feedback, and you're studying a score, maybe listening to the great masters performing this piece. That is a much longer time scale. That's something that we could look at with longitudinal studies where you compare, let's say, a beginning jazz musician and then that same person a few months later. So do you see any long-term brain changes? And one expectation is that regions of the brain that are important for generating ideas and evaluating these ideas that we generate might be changed as a result of creativity training.
You sort of mentioned two aspects to creativity. One is generating new ideas, and then the other is kind of winnowing through all these ideas that come up, some of which are good, most of which are probably not so good, and sort of that filtration process that also needs to happen to get the good fruits of creativity rather than just a bunch of garbage. Are you able to dissociate those two processes?
Yes, there are some fMRI studies that are trying to look into that. We're also doing some of this work. And it's not just for music and brain studies, but there are some visual creativity studies and problem solving types of studies that have looked at this intersection between different networks of the brain that are working together to evaluate and generate ideas. So there's this feed forward process of coming up with as many ideas as possible. And then there's this feedback process where you evaluate all your generated ideas and then choose the best one. And so there's two systems in the brain that are interplaying to enable that process. And one's called the default network, which is active when we're not doing anything. And that's been attributed to creative thought and incubation of ideas and also of daydreaming. When you're daydreaming, you might be in some kind of incubation period for new ideas to come up. Mm-hmm. And then on the opposite side of that, there's the executive control network, which is another set of regions in the brain that kind of play with the default network to evaluate the ideas. But then I also think that for musical improvisation, especially, we need to hear the sounds that we're about to produce and then actually produce them and then evaluate that. So there's another system at work, and that's the perception action system, which is important for listening to and generating sounds.
As you're listening to a piece of music in real time and thinking about like, okay, I'm going to jump in as a musician and add my piece to it now, also in real time, is there sort of like a listening ahead that takes place? Are you kind of hearing it before you play it, or are you just jumping right in with the expectation it's going to sound right?
I think we do hear it before we play it. We absolutely form a target and an expectation for what we're about to do. And we also don't just use our auditory system to form these expectations. We actually use our motor system as well. So I think there's more and more work now that suggests that when you're listening to music, you're not just using the auditory system, but the motor system comes in. And it might be the motor system that's driving the auditory system and not the other way around.
As I think about this applies to speech and it applies to almost everything. It's like at the same time you're processing what's going on right now in this present moment. It's like you're forward processing maybe about, a second or two while you're also analyzing what's going on in the present.
Exactly. Yeah, and sight reading in music and having a conversation in language are very similar. And improvisation is also a third kind of way where this forward and backwards process is really clear.
It's fascinating with something like music where the internal metronome needs to be so perfect. Everything really does need to be timed up properly. Do you see differences in ability there with one person versus the next, like just sort of whatever the equivalent to the internal metronome would be?
Yeah, so we have looked at individual differences in musical ability by looking at people who are tone deaf. So there's a little bit of work on beat deafness, but I haven't done that so much. But I have looked at people who are very bad at pitch perception and pitch production. And the main finding there is that there's a disconnect between auditory and motor parts of the brain. That there's a major pathway of the brain called the arcuate fasciculus, which we've found to be different in people who are tone deaf.
Can you tell me about your findings with music and how it relates to attention and how we pay attention?
Yeah, so this is very much inspired by, again, personal experience that there are some people who absolutely cannot work with no music on. And then there are other people who absolutely cannot work with music on. Right? And so like among my students, it's pretty much split. So the question becomes, how does music help us pay attention? And then part of this is also inspired by a recent collaboration of mine with a startup company called Brain.fm. We have a grant from the National Science Foundation together, firstly to validate their product. But to me, the real questions are, how does music help people focus? What is it about music that can help people focus, and who benefits from what it is that music does? So we're doing some lab tasks that look at attention and mind wandering, and that's inspired by a lot of work showing that people pretty much mind wander and daydream all the time, especially if you give people a pretty boring task like look at these numbers on the screen and press a button. Over time, right, even if you're doing quite well on the task, the reaction time will start to fluctuate, which is a good index for how much you're spacing out.
Yeah, if your mind isn't wandering, you're probably not human.
Right, exactly. And so what we're doing is looking at how different types of music can change that variability in reaction time. So BrainFM has this patent that purports to use music to change your brainwave by this process of brainwave entrainment, which might mean that inserting certain energy fluctuations or amplitude modulations into the music, you can selectively target some rhythmic properties of the brain. So I think it's nice to see how these theoretical debates, like how does the brain change its rhythm over time, can actually inform a product that you can use to help yourself work better.
To the extent that the research exists, is the type of thing that a person might be focusing on something that can be further dissociated? Like one type of music might help somebody focus on math, where you might focus more easily on a creative endeavor with a different kind of music, just depending on what you're actually trying to do with that focus.
There hasn't been so much research on this, and I think it's partly because composers don't usually write music to be played in the background. I mean, I think that different kinds of work do require different sounds to engage those brain processes. Most people will say that when they're reading, they can't listen to music that has words.
Yeah.
Right. So that really provides some support for this idea of shared resources between music and language, right? So if you're using those brain areas that are important for music, then you can't also use them for language. There's an interference.
Yeah, unless the music that you're listening to is sung in a foreign language and then it becomes background noise.
Yeah, so that again suggests that it's not just the sounds of the speech themselves, but the structural properties of the sounds, right? So when you're listening to foreign speech, you can't parse it into sentences so that those parts of your brain aren't engaged. And when you're reading, you do need to parse those structure. And so that's why I think foreign speech is okay. Yeah, like me, I speak Cantonese and English, and I can listen to Cantonese music and read in English.
Huh.
I mean, I also think that music varies by complexity. If you're listening to music that's very simple while doing work that's more complex, I think there would be less interference. But if you're listening to some complex classic, like a Mahler symphony, right, that's a very rich stimulus with lots of different hierarchical structures, I can't listen to a Mahler symphony and be reading a scientific journal article at the same time. But I can listen to Mahler and be washing dishes at the same time, right? Because washing dishes is not as structurally complex as reading a scientific journal article or listening to Mahler.
I feel like for the past couple of years, there's been a lot of beating up on the idea of multitasking. Unfortunately, because we really can multitask. What we can't do well, where the human brain is ill-equipped, is multi-focusing. We've got kind of a limited amount of attentional resources and a significant switching cost to switch between them. But you could probably be kind of in a steady state, giving the lion's share of your attention to one thing. But yeah, you're listening to the music in the background. And yeah, there's probably a slight drain there, but it's not a catastrophic drain.
And there might be some activities that help the main task. Like, I think that's also why music might work for things like working out or simple tasks like washing dishes. I think it makes sense that not all kinds of input to the brain are equally distracting, and that some might help others.
Yeah, I mean, you could think about like people marching in time to a drummer and things like that, where far from a distraction, that probably is helpful.
Yeah, or like those fidget spinners and fidget cubes that are so common right now. Right? I mean, there's a reason why some people like to keep them around. And I've also heard that I have some psychiatrist friends who will say that they don't prescribe them, but they recommend them to their patients.
Yeah, it would look kind of funny to put that on an actual prescription.
Right. I think it does go back to this idea that keeping some parts of your brain engaged might also prime other parts of the brain.
Can you talk about, I believe it's called a frisson, that physical chills up the spine sort of sensation that a lot of people get from listening to music, kind of the climactic moments in music, the crescendos, and what's actually going on there that gives this physiological response?
Yeah, do you get chills when you listen to music?
Yeah, but you know, I'll tell you, I remember getting them more in my early 20s than I do now. But I was also listening to a lot more like orchestral soundtrack music then. It was always kind of like the big scores, like Last of the Mohicans or something like that. And other types of music have never reliably done that for me. Yeah, I like other types of music, but I've never gotten like a frisson from gangster rap.
Yeah, I think it's been shown that in around teenage years through early 20s is when people are most likely to report getting chills when they listen to music. I mean, I think it might be some combination of coming of age and all these hormones going on and, and like also the need to use music to relate to other people. I mean, I think that this sensation of frisson, I think it really gets into why we have music. And to me, it's a channel through which we can communicate with other people where words don't necessarily apply. So while language there's a much more tight semantic reference. Like if I say dog, like there's a very clear idea in your mind about what exactly I'm talking about. Right? With music, like there's not like one note or one chord that can be the dog chord. But there are some musical sounds that can evoke certain emotions that maybe my language is not as good at relaying. So I think what music does through frisson is kind of link us closer to other people. And with some support for that, we've looked at comparing brains of people who often report getting chills versus brains of people who don't get chills. And now there are some general differences between them. So women are more likely to report getting chills. People who have musical training are more likely to report getting chills, which not so surprising. But after we control for all of those differences, what we find is that people who get chills tend to have more connectivity between auditory regions and regions of the brain that are important for emotion and social processing. And so that, I think, goes to the idea of people using music as an auditory channel to access the social and emotional reward areas of your brain. Then there's also the newer work on musical anhedonia.
Yeah, I've heard about this. These are people who basically music does nothing for them.
Exactly. They like money just as much as anyone else. They like good food. They like sex just like anyone else, but like music just does nothing to them. And what we're seeing is that there's a difference in connectivity between the auditory and these emotion reward areas of the brain.
I wonder if there are parallels to musical anhedonia with other senses. Like, are there people that don't like looking at pretty pictures?
I haven't heard of people who don't like looking at pretty pictures, but I think general anhedonia, also autism, there's a lot of connections there. So people who, despite having intact sensory access to sounds and to visual stimuli, they just don't get that emotional reward. So I think it's more like autism, and maybe it's a bit like depression, but much more specific kind, in that you have a lack of hedonic experiences in response to outside stimuli.
Right. But just in this one really localized domain, it doesn't necessarily mean that their lives are bleak and miserable. It just means that music doesn't really scratch any particular itch for them.
Right, and the person that we'd worked with who has musical anhedonia is actually very visual, and he's a photographer, and he goes to art galleries all the time. So, there might be some people who compensate for the lack of musical experience by seeking out other forms of experience.
For those people, are there any related effects that we see in their processing of language or any other sort of, fuzzy relations?
So when we looked at people who are tone deaf, they have all these subtle difficulties in understanding speech and producing speech. So for the understanding part, what we found was that when we low pass filter sound so that we make it sound quite muffled, and we ask them to tell the emotional content of speech, people who are tone deaf are not as good at identifying the emotional content of sounds. For musical anhedonia, we've only looked at one case of this, and it's quite rare. The musical anhedonic subject we worked with was not abnormal in speech or language at all. But what we did find was that he was also anhedonic for non-musical sounds. So a lot of people will say that it's not just music that they find pleasurable, but the sound of rustling leaves is also pleasurable. Or, the sound of the rolling ocean, or these environmental sounds.
Crackle of a campfire, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But he also found those to be not rewarding.
Where would you like to take your research next? Where do you see the biggest opportunities for surprises here?
I think of my work as about half pure research and half applied research. Pure research, I think the interesting questions have to do with emotion and creativity, the ones that we've talked about. But then I would want what we learn from research to actually inform some composition. So can we use the information we learn about prediction of the brain and the perception action system to make new music for ourselves? And I think the work that I was kind of talking about on music and attention can get there, because if we can use information from our brainwaves and from our reaction time to algorithmically compose some music for our brain, that kind of closed loop feedback system would be a game changer.
That sounds like it could be amazing if you had something like an EEG composing music on the fly a few seconds ahead of where your brain is at.
Yeah, and we've done some of that. We've looked at mapping EEG directly onto music, and there's so many choices you can make, right, about which exact of the EEG to map onto which exact sound. And it depends on why you want to do it. We've looked at using EEG sonification, right, which is the turning of EEG data into sound. We've looked at this in people with disorders like epilepsy, right? So when people who have seizures, there's an electrical storm in their brain, and this can be picked up using EEG. And so what we've done is map those EEGs onto pitches in music. And so just by listening to this music, you can tell whether someone is having a seizure. So we could imagine using that as a seizure detection device in the future. And I think that's an application for disordered brain activity. But even for just normal brain activity, like can we hack our brain so that when we want to get into a state of focus, there's some system that can detect that and then deliver the focus-inducing music. And I think if we can make that happen, then isn't music a drug? What's the difference between taking Ritalin to make yourself, focus better and putting on headphones? I think that will be where it goes in like the next, I don't know how many years. Can we actually have music be prescribable or just a medical device?
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Psyche Loui for taking the time for that conversation. I found the tail end of that conversation talking about where musical technology might go next as being one of the most interesting and exciting parts. You've probably seen the t-shirts and bumper stickers, things like "We were promised jetpacks. It's 2018 now. Why aren't we all on jetpacks?" And there's a little bit of truth to that, but what I remember wanting when I was a little kid was basically what now exists as earbuds and the ability to just carry around the music you want and play it when you want. Seems like kind of a modest thing to want now, but at the time when I was a kid, it didn't exist, and to me was what I perceived as like a major potential quality of life improvement. I think in many ways, the advancement of music technology is one of the most sort of egalitarian advancements of science. We've been able to fly for over 100 years, but we're still a long way from everybody having a jetpack or a private jet. Probably would be too dangerous to ever get there, but music seems to be one of those areas where tech advances percolate wide really fast. I gotta say, I really like the idea, see a lot of potential of being able to have music that is in some way fine-tuned to the listener in a way that's not currently possible. But if there was a real-time EEG skull cap, essentially giving you a real-time soundtrack for your day, your life, that sounds pretty awesome and also not terribly inconceivable now. And we will keep things not necessarily music, but at least audio themed, and even a little bit of a sound effect for you coming up next in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So the last episode of this show is basically about social illusions. And since this is an audio-themed episode with music, figured it would be nice to talk about audio illusions, which also do exist. Not something we think about as much, although probably the most common and obvious example is an echo. But there are in fact lots of different types of audio illusions. And one of the coolest ones is called a Shepard tone, which were first recognized and named by the cognitive scientist Roger Shepard. And I'm going to play one of these for you in just a second. But before I do, let me explain what this is. A Shepard tone is actually a combination of several different tones. They're each separated by one octave, and you can have either a rising or a falling Shepard tone. So either all the tones are moving up or all the tones are moving down. Where this gets tricky is in a rising Shepard tone, as the top tone moves further up, it actually fades out as far as volume and is replaced by a new tone fading in at the bottom end of the octave spectrum, also rising. So at any given time, you've got two tones that are strong in volume. They're heard to be rising, one that's fading out at the top, one that's fading in at the bottom. And what the human brain seems to do is kind of a majority rule system. It's like, well, we got three tones here, two of them are strong and rising, so overall what we're hearing is a rising tone. Kind of glosses over the fact that you've got this one fading out at the top, this other one coming in at the bottom. But the effect is that by basically looping this and just keeping this same system going on forever, it creates the audio illusion of a tone that continues rising indefinitely. So kind of a hamster wheel for your ears. It feels like it's building towards some sort of crescendo or come down, and it never actually gets there. It just builds and builds and builds. Listen to what this sounds like. And for those of you who are curious, I'll put up a link to this same sound on YouTube, where you can listen to it for 5 minutes straight through if you don't believe your own ears. You could loop it and listen to it forever. And you can create the effect of a Shepard tone with discrete notes like piano keys, or as you heard in the example there, with tones that fade smoothly into one another, technically called a Shepard reset glissando. And the eerie effect caused by Shepard tones has been known about and used for a long time. For you classic rock fans, way back in 1971, Pink Floyd's album Echoes made use of them. Super Mario 64, the video game from 1996, had a never-ending stairwell scene that also appropriately used Shepard tones. And more recently, the film director Christopher Nolan loves these things. He's used them in several movie soundtracks, worked with the composers and say, hey, integrate some Shepard tones. If you saw last year's movie Dunkirk, the soundtrack by Hans Zimmer uses rising Shepard tones throughout the score to create a feeling of perpetually rising suspense and menace. A pretty cool trick.
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, that's it for episode number 216. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find the links to everything that we talked about here up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/216. If you missed last week's episode, I spoke with Dr. Erica Boothby about the invisibility cloak, the liking gap, and other built-in flaws in human social cognition, the type of errors that we all tend to make. And next week, we're probably going to be getting into some villains of the brain, probably anthropomorphizing a bit too much, but we're going to be talking about headaches, migraine headaches, and epilepsy. I know that nobody likes headaches, but it's actually a really interesting topic. So I will see you back here next week for that. Same time, same podcast, and with that same unwavering commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week in the meantime, and of course, stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.